Hello, welcome to the Research Cat. What we're going to be looking at today is different ways to take notes. Now there's a lot of different ways to take notes far beyond the scope of this video, but what I want to look at is three different types of taking notes for three different subjects. So the first subject we're going to do is math, and then we're going to take one look at English, and then one look at a terminology heavy course. In this case, in the example here, we're going to use statistics, but it could be anatomy and physiology, or a computer science class, anything that has a large number of terminology to it. Now there's other methods that you may have found, mapping for instance, or a cluster method. And if you want to know what those other methods are, I'll put some links down below that will detail out some of the different methods, including the ones we're going to look at today. I could not find one on the grid, which is how I studied notes, but I do see that Grid Notes is a company that does structured note taking that uses the grid method. So there's a couple of different ways. There's no tried and true best way to take notes. It's really whatever learning style works out best for you. There are a couple of tricks that you can do though that will help you be able to study your notes more effectively. And one of them goes back to what we were discussing last week, which is there's a difference between the homework and the studying. So when you're looking at your notes, that's usually the studying portion, unless you need them to do your homework. But even then, you're looking at notes to be able to read what you're doing and being able to follow the directions. Now, one thing that I would do is take aggressive note taking. I went to college for 18 years. And so one of the things is you get into your higher level courses, your 300, 400, 500, 600, 700 level courses, and what you need is to be able to take notes, and then you need to not have gaps in those notes, because if the professor is talking and you said, oh, I understand that, that doesn't mean 2 weeks later, a month later, 16 weeks later, you're going to necessarily remember. I think one of the differences that students who are in college have to understand is the difference between, one of the differences between high school and college is that you're not necessarily going to take a test at the end of every week, like you would in most high school programs. In many high school programs, you're going to learn the material, whatever it is, and then you're going to take a test on it. In college, it's more likely that you'll learn 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 topics, and then you're going to take a test on a group of topics. As you go further up into your college training, you're going to find that those tests become fewer and farther apart. Many of my doctoral classes had they had some participation and they had essays, but generally speaking, especially when you got into the math courses, there were essentially 2 tests, a midterm and a final. And so I needed to be looking at some sort of a math notes and understand 8 weeks from when I first got the problems. Now, what I did in math is I used the grid method. I did not actually have it on the computer. I had it on a loose leaf binder, and then I would fold that page in half. And it would have just a grid on it. The bottom half would be folded underneath, so I'm looking at this part up on top, Although one of my friends used this method too, and he just covered this bottom part with his hand or with a piece of paper. Either way is fine. In this we have a basic problem and we have a solution. If I can look at this and say, oh, I know exactly what to do, I can solve this portion and then it's just a simple solution across, and I can get this answer, I'm not going to spend my time with what's underneath. I don't need to see it. I'm going to move on into the next problem inside of the binder of pages that I have. If, however, I'm sitting here and thinking, well, I can't just take the 6 from the 2 because this is all one value here. I'm not really sure how to solve this because I got that x in the middle. Well, that's where I need the rules. And so in my rules, I know that solving from left to right, I need to move from parentheses and exponents. I don't have any exponents, but I do have the parentheses, which means the first thing I have to do is the parentheses. And I'm going to solve them with the distributive power. And then after the parentheses, I can do any multiplication and division, and then addition and subtraction, until x is left on its own. If I can go back and solve this problem, breaking these parentheses out, which will give me 6 plus 8x, then I don't have to go any further. I can solve this, say, yes, I know how to do it, and move on into the next problem. And all the problems that have this format, I know then that I'll be able to solve because I've learned the rules to how to do it. If I don't know the rules, then I'm going to rewrite the problem down here. And in my notes, I've already taken this problem. This would have been a problem that one of the teachers would have put up on the board. We've solved it together as a class. So I know these answers are correct. And then I'm going to do exactly that. I'm going to break it out and use the distributive power. 2 times 3 is 6. 2 times 4x gives me 8x. Subtract 6 from that gives me 12. The 6's are like terms. Positive 6 and negative 6 gives me 0. Carries down the positive 8x equals 12. And then I'm going to divide 8x from the 12. And for some reason here I subtracted. I don't know why. So I'm just going to come in here and fix it now. So I'm going to have the 8 divided there, and the 8 divided, hello. Okay, and divide the 8 over here. And then 8 divided by 8 is going to give me 1, or x, because x is always 1x. And over here, I'm going to end up with, if I take, let's see, 4 goes into each one of these, so that's going to be 3, I like fractions, 3, 2. That'll give me a mixed number if I decide to go that far down, and that's going to be, or it will give me, so it'll either be 1, 1.5, or if I did it in a calculator, 1.5. Oops. Okay. So this is going to give me a solution. And in this case, I'm going to have now these portions. Now, if I get this wrong, I'm going to mark it somehow, maybe with a little piece of highlighter, and put a little corner up there on the side. And then I'm going to start moving these things away so that the next day that I go to look at it, I have just this up at the top. The next day I'm looking at it, can I think to myself how I'm going to do this? Perhaps I sit there and say, well, I know that I can get to 6 plus 8x, subtract 6 from that equals 12. That'll give me 8x equals 12, and then I subtract 8. Well, wait a minute, I think I made that error before. So I have to look at the rules again. And then I have to perhaps solve the problem again. Okay. Because one of the issues that I frequently run into with students is that they either get their signs wrong or they use the wrong operation, just as I would have done here by mistake. And obviously 8x, that's 8 times x, so I can't use a subtraction as an inverse of multiplication. The inverse of multiplication is division. This is one way of solving it. Now, I wouldn't go through, if I had 30 mathematical homework problems, I wouldn't do this 30 times. I would do it once for each of the styles of programs. So if I had a different math problem, perhaps solving fractions, then I'm going to do it, set it up this way. And again, I would take it from class notes that I know are correct. It also has the advantage that when I'm looking with an instructor and I'm sitting down in the tutoring, I don't need the tutors to go over, and I don't in fact want them to go over 20 problems with me that are very similar. Instead, I would much rather they spend one time with one problem and looking to see how that work is set up. Many of the problems that I run into at tutoring centers have to do with a lack of organization and a lack of understanding the process of what a problem is. So this notes here, taking notes, is really for understanding the process of a mathematical solution. So this is one way. But now let's look at a different way for English. Now, many people are familiar with, having been introduced to it slightly at least, a more formalized note-taking. Roman numeral 1, I want to take a look at Introduction to a Composition. The nice part about this style of notes, in a very formal sense, is that it allows you to essentially write down a essay. I may have to reorganize it a little bit, but I'm going to have all the structure laid out for an essay. So I'm going to start with Introduction to a Composition, and then in the capital letter A, I'm going to look at whatever that first thing is that I want to talk about. And I want to talk about a standard 5-paragraph format, and the first paragraph is the thesis. Then I have the next part. These would become the sentences that follow the topic sentence. So if the thesis is the last sentence, then what goes up in the top of that first paragraph? Well, that's your hook. Why does anybody want to read this work? And then I'm going to have the sentences below that, and then I'm going to move to the next topic sentence, which is a parallel between the thesis and the conclusion. And then I'm going to have the sentences following that, and then the middle paragraphs, and then the sentences that follow that. After I've done this, I now have the next part of the paper. In this case, it's problems with the standard 5-paragraph essay. There are a significant number of college instructors that are not always thrilled with the 5-paragraph essay. And one of the problems is that the 5-paragraph essay tends to be very generalized. That's not necessarily inherent to the 5-paragraph structure. It's inherent to the fact that you only have 5 paragraphs, and when you're typically in your first, second, and third years of college, and way more so as you move forward, you're just not going to be limited to 5 paragraphs. 5 paragraphs works out to be, assuming that your paragraphs are 4 sentences a paragraph, and that they're complete sentences, not fragments, you're going to end up about 800 words, or 3 pages double spaced. And that's too short to deal with any depth of most college topics. So we're going to be looking at usually having a longer format, 7, 8, 9 paragraphs, or larger than that. And so you may need a more developed thesis sentence. Typically, all of my last 5 years of college, that would have been the doctoral program, I would have 1 or 2 sentences up in, paragraphs up in the front providing the hook, and then I would have a thesis paragraph to carry the next 7 or 8 pages worth of work. One thesis just isn't typically enough to handle 12 pages of work with multiple paragraphs under each theme. So you're going to have headings, you're going to have a pretty sophisticated bibliography, and you need quite a few sources. In a 5-paragraph essay, when I taught English composition, students would come in with 2 or 3 sources, and that's all they had. And that's fine for the first year, perhaps, of college. But by the time you're a junior, you should really have developed more sophisticated sources, and you're probably not using your common sources on the internet. You're going to places like Google Scholar, or you're going to one of the open source libraries, or one of the libraries that is available through your college. So you want to show some depth, and you want to make sure that you have that depth is in a narrow scope. So I don't want to talk about, if I'm in a veterinary program in my junior year, about dogs are good, because I could write libraries on how I like dogs. And as I say that, my cat is on the keyboard. Come on, off the keyboard. So instead, I don't want to write a library of books, and I don't want to keep it too overly general. So instead, if I'm in that veterinary program, I'm going to talk about perhaps ways to train a dog to sit. And that will be the 8 to 10 pages on one particular topic. That's very specific. I'm not training the dog, not talking about different ways to train the dog to go hunt or to roll over. I just want to look at how to sit. So that would be one particular way of narrowing the scope. I like this method. It doesn't necessarily work out well when you're jotting down notes, particularly from an instructor that may not be completely organized. So what I would generally do is, because I liked this for my composition heavy classes, is I would just jot down notes wherever I could, and then I would say, well, now when I come back home, I'm going to rewrite those notes. Now, I'm a very kinesthetic learner. I don't learn as well from necessarily reading over things. I learn better from writing things down. So by rewriting my notes, I would get some studying done right then. And then I would reorganize them and set them up. Typically, I set my notes up inside of a computer program, very similar to this. This is Word 2020. But I would set up my program, and in this particular case, I would have EndNote attached, and I would have Grammarly attached. And so I would make sure that I have a good set of notes to be able to work from. Now, this works out good for composition, but it's not necessarily the best for something that's more terminology heavy. So when I have a stats class, for example, and I have a ton of terminology, I would end up more with the chart method. And I think I spelled definition wrong. I did. Excellent. Can I get in there? Not that easily. All right, well, spelling to the side. So in the chart method, you're going to have one part here, which is your terminology. And so that's what I have here, is I have the terminology that I'm looking for. Now, in my stats class, my terminology went on forever. I had pages of this. And so then what I would do is be able to fold the paper, or I would set it up inside of a program. I actually set mine up inside of an Excel program and then hid these columns. Well, these two columns. And then I would say, well, Spearman's row, what is the definition? I'm looking at ranked ordinal variables. I'd give an example and then I would check it. And then the source, and I see this missing too often on students who do chart method. If it's all coming out of one textbook, put down the page number so that you can go back and find it. If it's coming from multiple sources, like it did here in this example, then I want to put down the sources over here. I don't necessarily need the formal links that are going to go into, say, a paper. I would want to put the more formal links into perhaps a bibliography at the end, or as long as I can find these, I don't know that I care that much. I know that I can go into Google, type dictionary.com variable, and I'll get this definition. So I don't know that I care that much about this. On something like this, I want to have the link somewhere else. And by the way, the link is in the description below. So then I go down to the next one. Well, Pearsons R. What's the difference between Spearman's row and Pearsons R? Well, Pearsons R is a linear relationship between two continuous variables. An example might be in medical, measuring a blood type change across a period of time. And then correlation, making sure that I have somewhere in there that causality is not part of the correlation. So it's height and weight, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this is always going to be the case, right? There's a degree of significance in it. And then so forth for the ordinal, for the variables, for the numerical, for categorical. By the way, the three general types of variables are ordinal, numerical, and categorical. The cardinal variables are for measuring how much of something there is, and so typically that's not measured inside of a stats class. And so if this was I used this also during the computer part. Now for terminology that I really struggled with, I would set that up then in flashcards, and I talked about that last week. Flashcards are nice, you can carry them around. I would be frequently waiting for something or other in the car, either for a person or a friend driving, and so while they run into the pharmacy, I would then pull out my flashcards and be able to study. you don't necessarily have to study in any one location. I am a proponent for having a study area that you've set aside and you've put your notes there and you're organized in that one area. But I also like to take my notes with me and study in little small chunks rather than sit down and study for an hour or two. The human attention span is about 20 minutes for an adult. So for most people, going beyond 20 minutes, your ability to pay attention to any particular topic begins to fall off. So instead, I'll study for 20 minutes at a time or shorter. Sometimes students will come to me and they'll say, well, you know, I prepared for my English test and I studied for 3 hours. But I still only scored like a 40 and I don't understand why. Well, until I talk to the student and find out what they were studying and how they were studying it, what I hear is I studied for 20 minutes and then I wasted time for the next 2.5 hours. For any of you who have driven in a snowstorm or a heavy rainstorm, you may find that you get a headache just from the concentrating of driving that car in adverse conditions over a longer period of time, an hour, 2 hours. The same thing would happen when you study. If you're studying and you're studying for 2 hours and you're really concentrating for 2 hours, you might develop a headache. First, you really don't want to have a headache when you're studying because that's detracting from what you're doing and it's causing too many problems. Instead, what you want to do is study in a bite-sized chunk of time. If your attention span is only 5 minutes, then study in a 5-minute section and make sure that your notes are in a way that you can sit there and just study for 5 minutes. And while 5 minutes isn't a lot of time, if you study 5 minutes 4, 5, 6, 7 times a day across a period of weeks, you'll find that you actually get quite a bit of studying done. And that was one way that my medical students did when they had children at home. So the father would say, well, you know, I'm at home with the kids and I don't really have that much time to study. Well, take the time that you can get, have your notes in such a way that you can study fast, and maybe that first time you can only study 1 or 2 lines before you have to go take care of the next problem, whatever it is, or you're studying inside of your work day. So you can do 2 or 3 lines at a time. That's fine. If this is 50 lines, then you're going to break it down into, I'm doing 2-3 times each day. Perhaps I'll get through that list of 50 words in the next 3 or 4 days. So this is the chart method. I definitely advise people to have source work here. If it's a single textbook, put the page numbers down so you can find it. When we talk about next week, and I'm talking about studying efficiently, I am not a fan of people who take their highlighters and turn their textbooks yellow or pink or green, because it's very hard then to find what terminology that you're looking for, and that's something that I see frequently that students do. This is the more formalized Roman numerals. Then you're going to have capital letters, then the smaller letters, or sometimes you get ones here, and then the A's below it. And this really just sets you up for composition. This is a structure for writing a paper. I can reorganize this a little bit, relabel them, but I basically have my main headings, my thesis sentences, my topic sentences. This would be my thesis, my topic sentence, then what those parts are, and then it comes down to the next one. Perhaps this is a heading, depending on what this paper is actually going to turn into. And then if I switch here, I have a grid for doing math. Notes are typically for the purpose of studying. They may be helping you in your solutions for homework, but typically you're going to find that you're taking notes so that when you get home you can remember what was in the class. That's your studying portion. And it's very important for classes where the textbook is only a portion of the assignments. So if I went into a class and 50% of the class is coming from notes that the instructor has explained, and it isn't in the textbooks, then those notes have to be very complete. I will come back and then I will rewrite those notes. Another thing to consider is that if you have a 3-subject notebook, you might consider putting in the first subject the notes that you're taking. In the second subject, your examples, and in the third subject, your rules, particularly if you're looking at something that's rules heavy, such as math or a particular chemistry or biomedical lab class. That gives you a different type. So if I'm looking at the instructor going up and putting on a procedure for how to wash my hands, then I want to put that procedure into the third section. I don't want to have to go through and sort through 20 different pages to be able to find that section on the procedures at the end. Next week we'll be looking at different ways to organize efficiently so that you can study without spending a lot of time that you're wasting on it. And this is something that students frequently do. I find is they will come and they'll say, you know, I've been studying all this time, but it takes me a long time to get set up. I don't really like studying. It isn't something that I find works for me. And that's fine. It's usually when I talk to the students because they haven't studied very efficiently. They're wasting too much time either setting up or inside of the studying process itself. It's not that their studying is ineffective, it's just not very efficient. And I personally do not want to spend 4 hours studying for something when I could do it in an hour. Those other 3 hours I can either be working, or in my case right now, probably playing video games. So that's what I'm looking to do. If you found this helpful, you can put it down, give me a thumbs up. You're always welcome to subscribe. I'm trying to get out at least 1 video a week right now. The next set of videos will actually be on some math games which have to do with order of operations. And then we'll take a look later at a game for that's pretty good, not only for problem solving, but for angles and geometry. And that's a shooter based game. If you have any questions, you can always, or observations, you can always put them in the bottom. And if you'd like to see a hard copy of the notes, or how note taking can work in a on a notebook instead of through the software, you're always welcome to do that as well. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.